This is the second video in the JonBenét series. In the first one, we cover how the Ramseys managed to get exonerated. And even though the Ramseys were exonerated by the evidence, even with said evidence, the police still believe that the Ramseys were guilty, as almost everybody else. But why? Before we get into the case that the police built against the Ramseys, we need to go over the murder itself. Briefly, I promise.
Okay, what's your name? Are you
Kathy Ramsey, I'm the mother. Oh my God! Please.
I'm sending an officer over, okay?
Please.
Do you know how long she's been gone?
No, I don't. Please, we just got out and she's right here. Oh my God, please.
Okay,
Please, there's somebody.
I am, honey.
Please.
Take a deep breath in,
Please,
okay?
hurry.
Patsy.
Because the way that first day unfolded shaped almost everything that came after it. On December 25th, 1996, the Ramseys spent the morning opening presents before getting ready for a Christmas dinner at their friend's house, Fleet and Priscilla White. According to everyone in the dinner, the evening went normal. The adults socialized, the kids played, nothing stood out as unusual. Around 9 p.m., the Ramseys drove back to Boulder. 6-year-old JonBenét fell asleep during the way home. According to testimony, John Ramsey carried JonBenét all the way to her room. She didn't wake up. Patsy would later say that she changed JonBenét and tucked her into bed, leaving her sound asleep. Burke Ramsey, who was 9 years old at the time, said that he'd stay awake for a while, playing with his new toys, before eventually going to sleep. The family planned to wake up early that day because they had a scheduled private flight over to Michigan, their second home. Later, they would head to Florida for a second vacation. Then came December 26. At approximately 5:52 a.m., Patsy called 911. She told the dispatcher that she had found a ransom note and that her daughter was missing. Then she frantically said that she had been kidnapped. As officers arrived at the address of the Ramseys and they first spoke with Patsy, they immediately sensed that there was something off in the way that she made the 911 call and what they were facing in front of them. It apparently was a different Patsy. In any case, the whole thing didn't feel coherent. It felt something like fake to them. The ransom note explicitly said that they shouldn't call the police or anybody else, or JonBenét would be killed. Nevertheless, Patsy did exactly the opposite. She didn't only call 911, but she also called victims' advocates, her friends, the family priest. Officer Linda Arndt at some point said that it felt like the whole neighborhood was inside the house. The officers who arrived at the house and saw the ransom note entered in disbelief. The note was unlike anything they had ever seen. It was 3 pages long, a sort of manifesto. It demanded $118,000 in exchange for JonBenét, a very specific amount that would later be used against Patsy. Looking at the note, officers began to believe this was anything but a kidnap, and maybe the family was planning a ruse on getting money out of the business, insurance. At that moment, nobody knew that disbelief would prevent police to do what were they supposed to do, which was to secure the scene as a crime scene. Instead, they allowed people to roam freely through the house. Family friends cleaned the kitchen, the hallways, the living rooms. Only JonBenét's room had been secured and sealed off. Not before some people had gone inside as well. The house was barely searched beyond making sure that there had been no breaking and entering. Once that was established, the whole thing was abandoned. They started waiting for the call, a call that never came. At around 1 p.m., Detective Linda Arndt, now the only remaining detective inside the house, asked John Ramsey and his friend Fleet White to search the house from top to bottom one more time. That order may have sealed forever any real chance at solving this case. In later interviews, Linda Arndt would say that John Ramsey walked directly towards the basement and into the wine cellar, where he sadly found the remains of JonBenét. She was laying on the floor with duct tape over her mouth, a cord tied around her wrists, and another cord around her neck attached to a homemade garrote. A white blanket partially covered her up. Instead of preserving the scene, John took JonBenét to the living room, where he placed her down on the floor and covered her with a blanket. Patsy launched herself on top of JonBenét's body, sobbing uncontrollably. But Linda Arndt would say later that Patsy didn't shed any tears. It all seemed acted. People went down to the basement to see the crime scene. Officer Linda Arndt did not do what people expected out of her, which was secure the crime scene. Instead, she had asked emotionally involved people to do the search of the house, John and White. In the process, the crime scene was destroyed. And then she called 911 to get help. Once the body was found, suspicion turned towards the Ramseys. FBI investigators, now without a kidnapping case, left the case on the Boulder police hands with a message. Somebody in the family did it, because parents killing their child apparently is not rare. As the FBI pointed out, in this case says most of the time a family member is the culprit. But what really made the police focus on the Ramseys was the note and the behavior. I mean, they did some weird stuff. Only hours after JonBenét's body had been discovered, John Ramsey informed police that he wanted to fly to Atlanta. According to him, he wanted to be with family members for the funeral service. Detectives, however, saw things in a different light. To them, it looked like a man that wanted to flee jurisdiction. On the very day the remains of his daughter had been found, JonBenét's body was taken to the coroner's office that afternoon. DNA was found on it. Not that at that point mattered to the police, because for them, the Ramseys already looked guilty. But to understand the police position, we need to go back to 1990s DNA technology analysis capabilities. It took time, it wasn't reliable, it needed pristine samples, none of which were found in this case. The sample was small to say the least. It was contaminated with other DNA samples. It was as far as you can get from pristine, and by 1996 standards, police investigators considered the samples useless. RFLP DNA analysis was slowly being rolled out of service, replaced with STR analysis, which was faster and more accurate. But even STR technology needed somewhat of a clean sample to work accurately. Now, over a couple of years, the technology would advance impressively, which would change the whole case in the future. But at that time, for police, they simply had no reliable evidence to be based on DNA. So when during the autopsy DNA was actually found on JonBenét, in the minds of the police, it was of little use. So they went old school. They dismissed the improbable in favor of what they believed probable. And in old-fashioned investigations, one of the first things that needed to be established was the reliability and trustworthiness of the suspects. And Patsy and John, willingly or unwillingly, were about to lose that trust. There were inconsistencies in the story that they told police. According to investigators, Patsy was wearing the same dress that she wore on Christmas dinner. In their eyes, that meant that Patsy hadn't gone to sleep the whole night, as she claimed, a detail that was fundamental for her alibi. And her story of waking up and finding a ransom note and then going to look for JonBenét. In one account, John Ramsey leaves JonBenét asleep in her room. In another, Patsy puts her to sleep before changing her into her pajamas. For police, those were two different versions. For the Ramseys, it was just one progression. John carried JonBenét, and Patsy changed her into her pajamas, without her really waking up. But police were deadlocked in the fact that they had two versions, and in one of those, JonBenét hadn't been sleeping all the way through the night. Patsy changing her for the police meant that JonBenét had woken up. And the fact that this story kept changing as they asked suddenly became signs of a lie, a story make up on the fly. Police found a bowl of pineapple in the kitchen. Later, the autopsy revealed pineapple leftovers in JonBenét's stomach, meaning that she had in fact been awakened, taken a snack actually, before her demise, challenging the version of John and Patsy that she had been asleep. And for the police, if they had lied in a simple detail, now that meant that they could probably were lying about the whole thing. Which brings us back to the note, the ransom note. It was 3 pages long and rapidly established that it had been written out of a notebook belonging to Patsy, written with a pen belonging to Patsy, and with a handwriting that resembled Patsy's. The ransom amount of $1,800 was very close to John's year-end bonus. The content of the note itself didn't make any sense to the police. It was not a usual ransom note. The alleged perpetrators claimed that they belonged to a small political faction. And then it went over giving advice to John on how to carry out the withdrawal of funds from the bank, saying that he needed to be rested. From this, police derived that whoever wrote the note felt something for John, giving way to the theory that Patsy might have written the note. Usually ransom notes are short and to the point. This one was anything but. Another inconsistency would be the story of how the ransom note was actually found by Patsy. In the first version, she said that she first went down, saw the note, and then ran towards JonBenét's room, where she found out that she was missing. And then in another version, she turned it around. She first went to JonBenét's room, and then she went down the stairs and found the ransom note. So the way the ransom note had been found had changed dramatically in a couple of hours. This added to police concerns that the note was just a ruse, designed to derail the investigation from focusing on the real culprits, the Ramseys. The movie The Ransom, starring Mel Gibson, had been released a few months before, and police couldn't help but see the similarities in the case, with one massive difference. They had a body in the coroner's office. Police not only determined that the note had come from a pad owned by Patsy, but that 3 attempts had been made. This from the marks left on the paper, raising questions on why would the perpetrator stay for more than 40 minutes writing down a note when they had already killed JonBenét, exposing themselves to be discovered. It really made no sense. I mean, at that point, the police theory was that this note had been written after the fact that JonBenét had been killed. For them, it looked like a cover-up, which would explain the kind of childish content of the note and requesting a precise amount that matched John Ramsey's bonus. Things that for the police, only Patsy would know. So the note itself became the fuel for the case against the Ramseys. And one of the main issues that they couldn't explain is why Patsy would have violated all the instructions from the note, almost making sure that her daughter would have been murdered. I mean, the note did said not to call the police, and she called not only the police, but almost the whole neighborhood. She called the police using a landline, which if you grew up in the 90s, you would know how easy it was to tap a landline. So why not use their cell phones? Patsy explained it as panic and as not thinking straight under the circumstances. The existence of the note also presented other problems with the theory that a stranger killed JonBenét. I mean, why would someone whose motive is money leave the body behind when taking her would allow them to collect the ransom? Boulder police had only one answer. The whole thing was a cover-up. But by the time all this reasoning was happening, the crime scene basically no longer existed. That infuriated investigators, who in hindsight saw this as tampering with evidence and obstruction of justice. Nevertheless, the police department did make some questionable decisions that remain unexplained to this day. First, they had very little experience at handling crime scenes, and they refused the help of the FBI, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Now, by the second day after the murders, John Ramsey, in an interview, says that he received a call from a friend telling him that the police was going after first-degree murder and second-degree murder for him. They were pinning the murder on them. As a result, John immediately lawyered up. He would be able to refuse and deny Boulder police a proper interrogation. Not only that, but police was also unable to search any of the Ramseys' properties. They could only limit to guard the outsides, while waiting for the proper warrants to be issued. This only added to the investigators' suspicion. I mean, why would the Ramseys lawyer up if they were innocent? Why wouldn't they cooperate with interviews and letting them search the house properly? I mean, the Ramseys supposedly were trying to find a stranger that had broken in. And then the police department did another thing that is kind of unexplainable. They allowed Pam, Patsy's sister, to go inside the house and collect as many things as she wanted to, allegedly for the funeral. Police investigators involved with the case expressed deep frustrations at the fact. They claimed that Pam took several boxes from the house, even John Ramsey's golf clubs. On December 27, 1996, 3 days after the murder, the Ramseys hired an A-team of lawyers, publicists, private investigators. They stopped all communications to Boulder police informally, but they were dodging formal interviews also. So basically, they had cut ties with the Boulder police. On December 28th of 1996, police attempted to block access to JonBenét's body in order to use it as leverage and get the interview with the Ramseys. Now, the coroner rejected this police request and handed the body to the Ramseys. From January to April 1997, the Ramseys refused to sit down with the police. Their defense team demanded strict conditions before any meetings, including access to all police evidence and files. On April 30, 1997, After 4 months of intense negotiations between John and the police, Patsy and John finally sat down for their first separate formal interview. On January 15 of 1998, the avoidance pattern repeated itself, and the Ramseys refused to continue interviewing with the police. It was not until June 1998 that they finally had a second interview with the police. But from the 1997 interview, investigators in the case just got completely sure that the Ramseys were guilty. In said interview, the investigators asked Pat and John if JonBenét had been eating during that night. Both parents stated that she was asleep when they got back to the house and that she had gone straight to bed. However, the autopsy revealed that JonBenét's stomach contained pineapple. A bowl of pineapple was found in the kitchen, bearing Patsy's fingerprints, a fact that police had hidden from Patsy's and John's lawyers. For police, this just corroborated that Patsy and John were lying, at which point two different theories emerged. The first was that Patsy had killed JonBenét in a fit of rage and then cover up the murder. The second theory was that Burke, her 90-year-old brother, had killed JonBenét, and then John and Patsy had covered up for him.
What happened? What should I tell? How do you think that happened?
I think, well, I asked my dad where did they find her body, and my dad said I found it down in the basement, and so I think that someone took her very quietly and took her down the basement, and then maybe took a knife out, and or something like that.
You think that's how she died?
Or maybe a hammer in the head, maybe.
You see that?
In the middle of it all, the coroner stated that JonBenét had been abused before the murder. Now, these findings were not conclusive. They would never made it to a jury if they had gone to trial, but the police was informed about it. This added to the belief that the motivation behind the cover-up in either theory was to protect John because he had abused JonBenét. Now, the problem with all these allegations is that they were all circumstantial, and because of that, the DA never actually issued an indictment. Now, in reality, if the Ramseys didn't have the resources that they did, they would have probably been indicted, like 100% sure. But the DA knew that he was not only fighting a lawyer, he was fighting a full team, labs, experts, private investigators, and he had no case. Another inconclusive piece of evidence that came forth was the sound analysis from the 911 call that Patsy made to the police. Because, see, she hadn't hung up properly, and for a few seconds, sound was recorded. And after an extensive reconstruction using technology that would have never made it to a trial, police heard a conversation, an exchange of words between John Ramsey, Patsy Ramsey, and Burke Ramsey. Allegedly, John Ramsey says, "We are not speaking to you." Patsy Ramsey answers, "What did you do? Help me, Jesus." And Burke Ramsey answers, "What did you find?" Now, the Ramseys could play hide and seek with the police, but not Burke. He was the one family member the police could actually interview. Nevertheless, at the last minute, there was a catch. They couldn't actually interview. It had to be done through a psychologist. For the police, it meant a reversal. They could only watch from behind the glass. Now, Burke was odd. He seemed detached, unfazed from what had happened. But the child psychologist determined that he had nothing to do with the murder. Now, Burke's demeanor and his behavior told police a different story. For them, he was involved and he was hiding something. But after that interview, he was out of reach. By 1998, the police presented the case to the governor, who called a grand jury. Now, you have to bear in mind that the whole grand jury thing was kept in secret. This was revealed years after the fact. Around the same time, new DNA technology allowed labs to detect touch DNA, and touch DNA was found on JonBenét's clothes, matching the DNA that had been found on her underwear, basically solidifying the stranger theory. Now, police would argue that DNA could have come from anybody handling the clothes in the supply chain, from the factory all the way to JonBenét's wardrobe. But the problem the police had is that the DNA wasn't recovered from the underwear. It was recovered from the pajamas that she was wearing, and it was a match. Police spent close to $500,000 trying to recover DNA from the supply chain just to find a match, but they got no positive results. And the touch DNA basically rendered useless all of police allegations. Nevertheless, the grand jury actually recommended to indict the Ramseys for child endangerment causing the death of their daughter and obstruction of justice and aiding in a cover-up of a murder. In between the lines, they kind of had accepted the fact that Burke did it and the Ramseys covered it up. The district attorney, though, knew by this time that the case was unwinnable. Once the touch DNA had matched the DNA sample found in JonBenét's underwear, the Ramseys were basically exonerated. But even with that, the police department kept pushing for an indictment against the Ramseys, and investigators question to this day the exoneration of the Ramseys. They say that the DNA could have come from anybody. I mean, the crime scene was not preserved at all. They had a point in that. Then they pointed out that even though the basement window could have been a point of entry, undisturbed cobwebs at the time were proof, in their view, that the window had not been used as an entry point. And with that dismissed, there was simply no way to explain how a stranger had entered the house. And they would always challenge that the samples for the DNA were extremely in poor shape. But again, the DNA was evidence. What they had was circumstantial suppositions. It did not matter that the Ramseys acted like they were guilty, or that Patsy could not be eliminated as the author of the ransom note. It didn't matter that the Ramseys had destroyed the crime scene. It didn't matter that the ransom note itself didn't make any sense. In the end, for the DA, the only conclusive evidence was the DNA. So, what do you think? The Ramseys are guilty or innocent? I'll read you in the comments. And if you want to know what police left out from the public in the investigation and what ultimately exonerated the Ramseys beyond the DNA, you can watch the next video. That is all for today. Subscribe, it really helps the channel. Be careful out there, and I'll see you in the next one.